I want to give a big thank you to all my patrons, and I'll be doing a Kingsguard roll call after today's video.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Network, everyone. My name is, of course, Jimmy Nuts, and today we're going to be doing a no-spoiler review for We Ride the Storm by Devin Madson. It was a Patreon pick for me, I think last month on the random Patreon pick from my good friend JoBot. Shout out to him. And I was not sure what to expect with We Ride the Storm. It's book one in a bigger series called the Reborn Empire. I had to look at the spine to figure that out. Also, beautiful cover art here. Really, really love that. But yeah, I wasn't sure what to expect with We Ride the Storm. Heard some people had compared it to John Gwynne, saying, this is very fast-paced, combat-fueled, fantasy, more modern. So I was expecting extremely straightforward prose, and to kind of, maybe it would be forgettable. And that was just preconceived notions that ended up being really wrong, because I don't think that this is a perfect book by any means, and there are flaws I will talk about. But even with its flaws, I think this is a really interesting book. I'm very curious if people classify this as grimdark or not, because there is a ton of violence in this book, and not a ton of hope, even though I find myself rooting for the characters at some point. So let me know down in the comments, is this considered grimdark fantasy? I didn't see it labeled as that anywhere, but I think it kind of teeters that edge just a little bit. But before we get into the review and I kind of talk about what this book's about, what I liked, what I didn't like, I do want to ask you, please, down in the comments below, let me know, how does this setup look? I'm doing something totally different. I always get very nervous whenever I change audio settings, video settings, that type of thing. This is a more permanent setup and kind of something that I've been envisioning for a while. So if you can let me know in the comments how this looks, how it sounds, I would be very, very appreciative. There are some other upgrades coming to the channel down the road, but this is kind of a stage one. So if you could let me know how it looks, I'd appreciate it. We Ride the Storm is a sprawling, dark, gritty, epic fantasy that is Asian-inspired, which I'll touch on in just a little bit and how I found that. But we're landing in the world of Kissia, which has been through many rebellions, lots of war, but there's a god emperor now that is keeping the peace, trying to stabilize the regions, and there's two neighboring kingdoms. And unfortunately, all that peace that's very tense in the first place is about to come crashing down. That is a pretty general setup for a lot of fantasy. It is one that I happen to enjoy quite a bit. And you have just a lot of different parties at play here and different regions of people who all have varying goals in mind for the world. But I like the fact that there is some sort of emperor set up at first, and we get to see that royal court, and it all comes through the lens of Princess Miko. But Princess Miko is not just simply your run-of-the-mill daughter of a king. She is a bit of a prisoner in her own castle, as the book states on the back. And I thought Miko was a really good insight to a lot of the setup for what's been happening over the years. And what does this god emperor look like? How can we see him? Is he moral? Is he good? Not so much. But she has probably the best viewpoint in the entire book for me. And the reason why is because I actually like the politics that Devin Madson sets up. And with her lens, we also see probably the most complex character, which is her. Miko, I think, has more layers than the other characters in the cast, and that becomes pretty evident as she goes through a lot of turmoil as the plot moves along. There are two other main POVs in this story, and the other one would be another female named Cassandra, and Cassandra is interesting. I'm still not sure where I stand on her POV yet, but only thing I can say is that I wanted to keep reading it time and time again. Cassandra is a prostitute assassin. I mean, right there, that's okay, all right, I'm in. But she has a voice inside of her head, and this is one of those things that sets this book apart in some ways, but also is reminiscent of other stuff that I've read in the last few years, right? I think of Shalon from Stormlight Archive. I like this a bit more because it tends to go into a darker area of the psyche, and at times it's very complicated to figure out who's calling the shots in Cassandra's brain. So as the reader, I think it keeps me engaged just trying to figure out who's saying what. And this is all told from a first-person past tense perspective. I've never read a book that did multiple POVs from a first-person perspective that I can remember. I might be wrong. And I know there are others that do it. Red Rising, for instance, I know the sequel is all first-person present, multiple POVs. But like, that's an interesting decision in its own. And that's kind of what I said at the beginning of this review, is that there's just a lot going on here that I found to be really compelling. And one of those things is the fact that it is first person, past tense, multiple perspectives. That's a little bit weird. And a lot of this book feels like Devin Madson just kind of going for it. And I respect that. I respect a little bit of a gamble and trying to do something a bit different, even though there are very familiar beats and plot points in this story. But Cassandra is the one I think will be the most divisive for most people reading, just because having a voice in your head and also being a prostitute assassin is not going to be everyone's cup of tea. And her whole motivation, and this isn't a spoiler, to kind of give you an idea of what's going on with Cassandra, is that she is trying to cure that voice in her head. She wants it removed, even though I'm not so sure that's a good idea. So she gets sent on a task, gets hired, and that leads in her all types of trials and tribulations. And then the last POV is Captain Ra, who is a part of a cavalry of horse riders who have all kinds of talents in combat. I believe this is supposed to be reminiscent of kind of Genghis Khan and the Mongols. If I had to guess, I'm not a PhD or an expert on Asian history, but the more I read, I always see that kind of represented somewhere in Asian-inspired fantasy, and I believe that that is the role that these people are supposed to play. And Captain Ra is cool. I found myself really drawn to his POV because there's something about like the alpha male character that is then questioning their leadership, that is supposed to be the leader in some regard or achieves leadership and then is questioned by their crew, and they're making very tense decisions. Naor in Prince of Nothing comes to mind when I think about characters like this. I think Naor is far more complex and maybe more controversial. But Captain Ra was just fun to be around. Also, a lot of action happens to happen in his POV, which is a good time because Devin Madson exceeds very well when it comes to writing combat in those big emotionally tense moments. And we get a lot of that through Ra's POV. So even though Ra is a little bit one-dimensional, maybe a little bit one-note, I thought it was executed quite well. Not every character has to be super nuanced, super complex, and all these things. Sometimes they can just be what they are. And I think a lot of his interest in the story comes from the fact that his decisions are not easy ones to make. So even though he himself might seem a little bit straightforward, as a captain of this cavalry, it's the decisions that he has to make for his people that really don't have a stake in this game and get kind of pulled into this war that I found really fun to read. So I've already mentioned the fact that it is first-person perspective in multiple POVs, and I've got to tell you, I thought that this would be a lot more jarring than it was. The only time that I found this approach jarring was when I was doing audio. I was doing this audio and physical, kind of bouncing back and forth between the two, trying to get through it, not in a bad way, but just, that makes me read quicker. So with the audio, I found the fact that they use different areas for each character could have been really cool. I've seen other books do it and it's been successful, but I did not love this audiobook performance because some of the narrators were better than others. I think the one that did the Cassandra POV, if I'm not mistaken, especially with the different voices ahead, just kind of fell flat for me. When I was reading this physically, I gotta tell you what, I really enjoyed this approach. I thought it would be jarring, it was not. And that's because Madson does a good job of keeping you in the story. And the POVs never truly interact and sit down and have these big conversations, but they are intertwining, they are crossing paths in indirect ways, and it's almost like an Easter egg because you're seeing it from the other person's perspective, not third person, right? So you see a person cross the screen in your head, and you don't know that it might be that other POV. So it's kind of cool. Because in third person limited, yes, you do get internal dialogue and all these things, but when you have characters that are so vastly different in their approaches to this world, we got a princess, right, that's kind of being held captive in her own castle. We have Ra, cavalryman, and then we have Cassandra, who has voices in her head. I mean, it's just different lenses to look at the world. And I think that that's one thing that Madson really put a lot of time into, is making sure that the world was really being viewed from that perspective and not just the character living in the world. So really good. I don't think it's the most inventive world building of all time. I don't think it's the greatest setting of all time, but the characters fit, and that goes a long way with me. I want to touch on the fact that this is Asian inspired. I don't know if I care or that I even imagined it being Asian inspired. It felt like it didn't come forward enough for me. So I just wonder why the Asian aesthetic, other than maybe just that's something that Devin Madson enjoys, and that's fine. But reading Under Heaven, Grace of Kings, Dandelion Dynasty this year, I've read a decent amount of Asian-inspired stuff, and I gotta say that this is by far, when it comes to the Asian inspiration, feels the least quality out of all of them. And I am not a scholar when it comes to Asian history or anything like that, but I'm just saying it didn't feel like it mattered all that much. And in fact, in my head, I don't think I ever really thought of this being in an Asian setting at all. So then I have to wonder why.
Maybe because she wanted to, you nerd.
Well, that's fair. If an author wants to make that decision, they can. I'm just saying that it didn't really impact my reading, so then, I don't know if I could call that a success or not. When it comes to the actual prose and the writing and the style of this book, I really enjoyed the sentence variants and the way of taking very mundane statements and making them a little prettier. Not overly flowery, but just different ways and finding new ways of saying old things that we see in all types of different fantasy books. And it felt like a good, fresh, positive spin on a more straightforward prose approach, but not so direct to where it doesn't feel like it has any style or character. So I really, really enjoyed the writing, and I think that was the biggest surprise out of this whole book. And I always like to think at the end of the book, any book I read, what surprised me. And for me, it was the prose. It was the prose and the fact that I really wanted to read book 2 at the end of it, even though I did have some complaints. And a lot of that is because I feel like Devin Madson has a strong grasp on how she wants to write her books. The plot is very violent. Moments in this book all throughout, not just the end, really caught me by surprise. If there was any kind of criticism when it comes with this, is that I feel like there was just way too many decapitations. People lose their heads in this world constantly. And, if you go to the well too many times, at some point it can kind of lose the effect. It kind of reminds me when I was in wrestling, when I was in professional wrestling. Jim Cornette always said, if you walk outside and you see a giraffe and an elephant mating on your front lawn, the first day you're like, what in the world? You go tell everyone at work. Second day you do it again. But, after a week or two of seeing them mating on your front lawn, you go, I've seen this before. And then it just becomes a part of the day. And that's a weird thing to say, but I feel like that kind of applies to some of the violence in this book, especially with the decapitations. There is not just a large body count, but a large head count. The political maneuvering, it's not the most refined of all time, but it's good. And I really did enjoy that piece from Miko, Princess Miko. I think her character, I enjoyed more of what was going on around her than I ever enjoyed being with her. And the side characters, from every single perspective, were really impressive in the fact that some of them, maybe even I wanted to read more about them than I did the main POVs at times. There's decisions made in this book that are really hard to justify without just saying that the character is a complete moron, which is fine, but I feel like, especially with one of the characters that is in Miko's POV, wasn't supposed to be an idiot, but ends up making a really dumb decision, and it didn't get time. It was a big moment. I mean, it's pivotal to the plot, and for Miko. Didn't really get flushed out, and I think it just made the characters be dumber than they were supposed to be, and I could be wrong about that. But some of the characters come across really, really stupid. But it got me hooked the whole way through, and I can't deny that. It also has just one of my favorite general themes in a book, especially when it has barbarians, is who are the real barbarians, right? We're looking through Raw's POV, and he's starting to describe things that happen to his people from the civilized kingdoms, and you're like, damn, they're more brutal than the barbarians of this story. So that's a pretty general theme that we see a lot in fantasy, but I'm here for it here, and it's done well. It's not something that is going to be inventive or, the most mind-bending thing you've ever read, but if you're into that kind of theme and that inspection, I think that you could enjoy this. Being more modern, combat-focused, the pacing is fast, it's tight. I never felt bored in this book at all, but I have to say, I thought the pacing was just a little bit odd. Times wherever I thought the gas pedal would get stepped on a little bit actually got kind of dialed back, but it works. So when I say the pacing's odd, I don't want to say that the pacing is bad, because pacing is a very difficult thing to talk about, because you have paragraph pacing, you could have chapter pacing, you could have section pacing, full book pacing. I mean, we could go on and on and on. But just overall, it was really hard for me to put a finger on what was coming next, which is kind of fun. But at times I wonder if we could have had just maybe a little bit time after a big moment to settle in and really go through the progression of what it meant for each character or even the surrounding cast from a POV. And this really ties back to the really dumb political decisions that are made by people in Miko's POV. Like, dude, they're dumb. but I had so much fun. Like, I was entertained the whole way through this thing. And it was what, 500? It's like 500 pages or something. So it's not the biggest fantasy book of all time, but it's not the shortest. But it felt like a 300-page book when I got done with it, and I wanted more. So for everything that I'm saying, you know, there are some cliches in here. Oh, also, there is a moment where they're playing like a chess equivalent, and they're using the board to relay like real world dynamics. I don't know. I'm so over it. I see this in so many fantasy books, and this is just me, and it's a subjective thing, but I'm good. Like, Crevasse was cool the first time I read it, but now every time I read it, when I do a reread of A Song of Ice and Fire, I'm like, I'm good. I don't need to read this. You know, it's placing the pieces and it being metaphorical for the characters in world. I'm tired of seeing it. That is a completely subjective thing and should not sway you one way or another. I just had to say it because it's my review and I get to. But I was entertained. I had fun. I was engaged. I liked the writing. It feels like the ceiling of this series is really high. And I think that most people have said that the books that follow this in the Reborn Empire are actually way, way better. This is also not a debut. I thought this was a debut. That's not true. Devin Madson has written other things. There's a prequel series, I believe, before this that kind of flushes out a lot of the history. I find myself kind of wanting to go back and see how things got this messed up from the past. So at the end of the day, is it a 5-star book? No, it's not. But was this a really fun, entertaining modern fantasy read with really good, tense, emotional moments in combat? Yeah, it was. The cast of characters are definitely dynamic, maybe except Raw, but I loved Raw. Raw was probably my favorite POV, even though he was straightforward. So I don't know. There's a lot of things in spite of flaws that I found or things that I found a little bit grating. I was just really, really invested. So if you're looking for a good palate cleanser and you want a book that is relatively short, like 500 pages isn't the worst, I think you could jump into this. And yes, it is a series, but I didn't feel like I had to pick up book 2 immediately. Like, a lot happens in here and there's pretty good ending points that leave threads for the future. But you wouldn't have to like jump into the second one immediately. Now, with that said, I really want to read book 2, and I think I'm going to try to do it this year if I can sneak it in somehow with all my planned reads. But I would recommend it to you guys. I really would, especially if you like, you know, John Gwynne, a little bit faster pace. I think the writing is a little bit better than that here, and I'm very impressed with Devin Madson and look forward to reading more of her work. If you like this review, please hit like. Think about subscribing. If you disliked it, you can hit dislike. You know, I'm going to be doing tons more book reviews down the road. I got a lot of stuff I'm excited to talk about, like Earthsea, the Second Apocalypse, all kinds of stuff. I do spoiler discussions here and live streams, bookish podcasts. I'd love to have you part of the channel. So think about subscribing. I do have a Patreon in the description. It's optional, but always appreciated. And until I see you next time, be good, be safe. And remember to always keep turning the page.
I want to give a big shout out to all my patrons, especially my high-tier patrons, my Kingsguard, which include Lauren Henrik, Kai, Simon, Oscar Stewart, Josephine Ikaika, Amanda, RJ, Shad, Nicoletta, Tanner, Jennifer, Garrick, Frank, Evie, Fever, Welcome to My Mind, Jay, Sarah, Pat, Kevin, Ryan, Michael, Terrence, Wade, Darren, My Book is Lit, Derry, John C., Boss, Mitch, Sebastian, Benjamin, Joe Bot, Noel, Amanda L., Kyle C. Scott, and Stephen R. Thank you all so much. You're the best.